And welcome to day 5 of the Orkney International Science Festival 2024. My name is Eric Walker, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this inaugural Pete Oswald Memorial Lecture. This presentation is dedicated to the late Pete Oswald, who tackled many engineering challenges, building up to the production of synthetic fuels from hydrogen and captured carbon. He and his collaborators built Orkney's first synthetic fuel demonstrator and made fuel that was then used by the RAF in the world's first successful flight using only synthetic fuel, a Guinness World Record. Now, I wasn't originally scheduled to be the speaker host for this event, but first thing on Thursday morning, I just happened to bump into Neil, and he said he was delivering the Pete Oswald Memorial Lecture on Monday. And I replied, "Oh, I was at university with Pete." Neil's eyes lit up, and he asked if I was the speaker host for this talk. I said no, and he goes, "Oh, well, you should be. Can't you arrange that?" So I did, and I'm here now. I met Pete when I was 17 years old, and I just started my first year at Heriot-Watt University. Pete was pals with my great friend Grob, who sadly has now also passed, and they were both studying mechanical engineering, specialising in their honours year in a brand new branch of that discipline, offshore engineering. They were amongst the first offshore engineering graduates recruited into a rapidly expanding and very much changing industry. Pete had a love of motorbikes, as did many of us in that crowd, and we all immersed ourselves in the non-academic joys, which may have included imbibing a little too much barley juice in the Students' Union many times over the next few years. I was fortunate that I met up with Pete many times in the early years after we all graduated, and we always resurrected our social activities each time. As our careers took different paths, our meetings lessened. However, fate is always about to play a part in our reconnecting. A few years ago, I was speaker hosting a talk in the Orkney Theatre, and I couldn't help but keep checking into a face in the audience that I thought looked familiar. It bugged me the whole talk, actually, but when the talk finished, I this beaming and loud booming, happy, smiling face of a man, which is Pete. He came up and he nearly shouted out in front of everyone, "Hi Eric, how are you doing? How are you doing? Long time no see. Glad to see you." Anyway, we met up every year at the Science Festival after that, and very much looked forward to each year. One evening, at home in my garden, I received a phone call from a close friend. "Pete's died. I'll get the funeral arrangements for you." Unfortunately, circumstances meant I couldn't attend his funeral or his memorial service. That was such a shame. However, my chance encounter with Neil last Thursday has given me the opportunity to deliver this personal tribute to Pete, and I'm so grateful to you, Neil, for letting me do that. So thank you very much. And I also need to thank Maha, Louisa, and Kellen for rearranging the schedule to accommodate me to do this. So anyway, now I can feel Pete's arms around me and him whispering in my ear, "That's enough now. Best be getting on with things." So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So before we begin, I need to go through some housekeeping. There are no planned fire drills or tests. Oh, here we go. Some of you were here earlier, I'm sure. So if you hear a fire alarm, it is for real. The fire exits, there are 3 fire exit doors, 2 down here and 1 up at the top that you came in. The muster point will be out in the car park. Could you also just check your mobiles and switch them to silent for us, please? And we also encourage you to participate in our session. Your questions can be submitted.
5 down.
Your questions can be submitted through Slido if you just put your camera phone onto the QR code there. There's a little link will show up and you just click on it and that'll take you to the Slido app and you can type in your questions. However, we also have our roving mic in place, so at the end of the session, if you just raise your hand, we'll get the microphone to you and you can ask your questions in that way. Now, to introduce the speakers, here we have Neil Kermode and Gareth Davies. Neil is the Managing Director of EMEC, Fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, member of the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, and a chartered environmentalist. He co-chairs the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum and is an ardent Science Festival supporter and attendee. He was awarded an OBE in the First King's Birthday Honours. Neil and Gareth first met back in 2003 at the Renewable Realities Conference run by Aquatera in Stromness. Gareth has been a leading light in the development of renewables in Orkney for decades through his company Aquatera, with a long-term membership and leadership of the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum. Orkney's role as an energy exporter has continued to develop, with oil now joined by renewables. What are the storage options and alternative uses of that energy over the next 5 to 10 years? And the infrastructure we need to put in place to get the maximum benefits? Well, Neil and Gareth are about to enlighten us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's super, and for those of you that are ardent Science Festival attendees, you'll know that the fire exit worked very well earlier this morning. So if you happen to need it, it's all functional. Um, so what I want to start with is Orkney, and it's maybe an obvious question, but there's actually quite a complex answer. What is Orkney? And what I'm putting forward is that there's three things really. We've got the islands that we always think about, the land that we love, and the archipelago that we all live in. But we also have the waters around Orkney, and the definition of what Orkney waters are is something that is perhaps worthy of revisiting. And again, those of you that were lucky enough to be at Tim's talk earlier this morning, it poses the question to us about what are we going to do with the resources at our disposal in the next 20 or 30 years. And the first question is, well, what are the resources at our disposal rather than somebody else's disposal? And so that map in the middle uses the law of the sea rules, if you like, to define Orkney waters in the red area. And you can see it extends quite a way beyond the 12-mile fishing limit, which is typically used as the administrative boundary in regulations. And the other part of this story is obviously that Orkney has influences and connections literally all over the world. And that diaspora has been very important for Orkney on many occasions, and no less so today. So it's not just what we can do in the islands, it's what we can do with the people that are connected to us and with us. And if we take that map of the seas of Orkney, Orkney's waters, and think about what's in them, there are some interesting things that are happening. The first one on the left-hand side is if you look up at that red circle, that's something called the Solan oil field. And that's been developed. The gas goes to Shetland, but actually the footprint of it, if we accept the premise of Orkney Waters, lies within Orkney Waters. And I don't think we've ever acknowledged that we actually have an oil field within our reach, as it were. I don't think we get any specific benefit from Solon at the present time. And then the right-hand map is perhaps more familiar to people, and these show what are called the ScotWind lease areas, and these are the offshore wind sites that have been leased through the Crown Estate within Orkney Waters, obviously. They didn't quite consult with us as landowners when they were offered. And what that shows is there's actually 5 circles, 5 developments which have a partial or full footprint within Orkney's waters. And so as we're thinking about what infrastructure and what relationship we're going to have with these developments, it's maybe worthy of thinking about the five, because at the moment we're probably only negotiating with two of those, and we need to think about what is our relationship, not just with these ones, but the ones nearby as well. So that's hopefully a little bit of an introduction, a teaser, if you like, to some of the points we're going to make in the next half an hour or so about how we've used the energy on our land and in our waters around us. I'm going to pass on to my glamorous assistant, Neil.
Thanks, Gareth. So we're going to rattle through a whole number of different topic areas, but one of the pieces we did want to talk about was very much about Orkney's role in the future. Because we routinely tell civil servants and politicians who come up that Orkney is very much their future. And we want to try and explain a little bit about why we believe that's the case. Because if you look at the way the energy system is going to work, we are in a place which is dominated by renewables. Our energy system in the UK looks like this, which is the green line is generation that is taking place, and the grey line is electricity consumption. This was a couple of years ago, and so work was done as part of a project that looked at what would happen in the future if you simply increase the amount of renewables, not new types of renewables, just existing types. If you quadruple the amount of electricity generated from renewables in the UK, you'd end up with that green jagged line, and that is what Orkney is doing at the moment. So our point is that Orkney is very much already there and is dealing with a great deal of variability. And it does this in a way that has allowed a supply chain to develop and is exploring new ways to harness the energy that we've got available to us. And my thanks to Martin Leos at the back for some work that he did some time ago showing the way the energy flows have changed over time in Orkney. This is looking at the interconnectors across the island, and the top goes from 2008 and the bottom goes to 2018. Each horizontal line is a month, each dot is a day. And basically, red is importing energy, importing electricity, green is exporting it. And you can see the transition that's gone on over time. So we are already in a place which is moving forward. And the rest of the world is looking at how it is going to handle its energy flows. And particularly, this is an example of what's going on in the UK. These are some part of some scenarios I'm going to take you through that National Grid, or the energy system operator, as they now are running at the moment. And this is a piece of scenario planning, and this is showing what the energy flow of the UK, the energy flow of the UK is at the moment, with natural gas at the top left-hand corner, and then other fuels, which are basically the oily lot down the bottom end. Now they've done a series of options as to how we're going to get to net zero by 2045 in their planning, even though Orkney wants to go earlier. And if you take that scenario and compare it with the other three scenarios that they look at, I'm not going to talk you through all of them, but the important thing for me is that, oops, I pushed the right button. That's the most important thing. The up in this one on the top left-hand corner, you can see under say it's existing, so it's 229. You may be able to see that's the amount of electricity. But if you look at the amount that's electricity in all of the other scenarios, it's in the 700 to 800 terawatt hours mark. So they're all anticipating a great deal more electricity is going to get used. Now, some work was done by Gareth and his team back in 2019, which looked at Orkney's energy picture. So not the UK, this is Orkney's energy picture. And the green box shows the electricity that is being used. And you probably know that Orkney has been producing more electricity that's needed from renewables every year since 2013, as pretty much evidenced by that graph I showed of Martin's. And the point there is our electricity is green, but we know we're going to use a lot more green energy in various ways. And what's that going to look like? Well, we think in 2030, it's not just going to be this amount of electricity, it's going to be that amount of electricity. In other words, pretty much everything we use will have been electricity at some point in its life. It may get turned to other things, but it will be electricity. And that is really important because that is going to have an effect on everything, the way we live, the way we move, the way we operate our industry, our transport, everything. So that's what we think at the moment, but what's actually been going on, because that's 2030, this work was done in 2019, and we're lucky we've got a new piece of data that was just come out, which is the 2022 census, which was just published. And this is the information that I'm going to extract from Orkney. which basically shows how many households, not people, households, have got different types of energy systems. And there are some flaws in this data, one of which is the fact that several people think they're on mains gas, and also that they're actually on a district heating scheme, which they're not. But other than that, you can do some recycling of data and some reprocessing. But basically, the bottom line is quite interesting because it shows how many people have got two or more forms of heating in their house. And we would argue quite strongly that that two or four more forms of heating is probably an existing one and something else has been added. And that something else that's been added is probably renewables, probably an air source heat pump, might be a log burner, but probably air source heat pump. And so if you take that information and redistribute the numbers of the other types of heating system, because there are two of them, not one of them, so you can double that number from 1,500 to 3,000, of which 1,500 are going to be renewables. You end up in a position which is this, which actually translates to that. And what does that say? That says that roughly a third each of our heating systems are roughly a third each of oil and gas, electric, and heat pumps. And since we know our electricity is more than 100% renewables all the time, pretty much that means only about a third of our properties are now principally fossil fuel heated. And so going back to the diagrams of the audit, that really shows they're putting a squeeze on that bit of kerosene. So that's in 2019, and now there is a squeeze. We are moving away from oil at a reasonable rate of knots. So this is showing progress. The energy system is going to be different, and Gareth's going to talk more about how the future energy system will work.
So I think the key message here is that it's very easy in the world that we live in to think about the past and think about all the things we used to have. And the challenge for us in the world is that the world is changing. It has to change. And the way that we lived 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago just isn't going to be feasible going forward into the future. So it's really important that we think about the future that we need, not what we've had. And a lot of what we have in the UK is based around coal. So our whole industrial, and on the basis of that, our residential distribution, our infrastructure distribution is basically around the coal fields that fueled the Industrial Revolution. And obviously that was incredibly important to the development of the country. But that was now 150 years ago through to, maybe the 70s when really the last of the coal era probably died out. And so what we need to do is think about what is the distribution today. And what I've done here is use two maps which show the distribution of carbon emissions on the left-hand side. So those colors show the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that's being emitted per kilometer across the UK. And the yellow areas are the ones that emit most carbon, and the blue areas are the ones that emit least carbon. And I've chosen that because I think that's of the time. It's where we are, if you like. And then the right-hand map shows where existing onshore and offshore wind farms are located. And it's an obvious point maybe in Orkney, but it's not obvious in Westminster and Holyrood, that these places where our energy is coming from now are very different from where they came from in the past. And what we need to think about is if we're going to build a system, not just for now, but for the future, it might be worthwhile thinking about where our future energy is going to come from so that we build a system that's appropriate for that future. Because if we just build it on top of what is there in the past, we're going to end up going to the wrong places. We don't go back to the coal fields. So this is where there's a bit of a challenge. So one of the challenges is that very often the north is invisible to the system. Orkney, as you can see, is literally invisible. And I could have put 100 maps up here and got very, very frustrated that we're not on any of them. But that is unfortunately the reality. There is a whole industry which doesn't recognize the importance of the islands. And I put all three islands, Orkney, Shetland, and the Western Isles, in that basket, although the Western Isles are just on this one. And the reason for that, if we go back to the ScotWind round, is that the leasing that has gone on is predominantly around the islands. And the reason for that, as we all know, our winds are strong and therefore wind turbines can be very productive. Now, the seas are very rough because of that, and it's going to be technologically very difficult. But the energy for the UK is going to come from this part of Britain. And for probably 4 or 5 years now, we've had a an estimate that we think there's a credible pathway, or not just a credible, it's the only credible pathway to the UK getting to net zero, is for the north part of Scotland to be delivering 50% of UK electricity by 2050. And as Neil, I think, showed in his part of the presentation, that electricity is going to be providing everything. It's going to be providing ammonia, hydrogen, all the derivatives, as well as electricity. So we've always been very proud of Flotter, and in fact, we were all just bathing in that this morning. But Flotter delivered 10% of UK oil, 5% of UK energy. We're now looking at, and Sullom Voe delivered 25% of oil. So now we're looking at Orkney, Shetland, and the Western Isles delivering 50% of total energy to the UK. So that's a phenomenally important strategic position. What we need to do is see phenomenally good planning to cope with that. So this is an example then of where we are with some of the planning. And I'm just going to talk a little bit through this, but these graphs at the bottom, the yellow and the green and the blue, purple lines, these are different energy scenarios that SSEN has presented us with, and they represent their best guess at how our energy system is going to develop in the future. And I know Neil was trying to find or not, it's not that one. Definitely not that one. Is there? Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, so these lines here are the future scenarios. And when that was presented to us at OREF, what was troubling for the start is that the net zero position, which is here at 350 roughly megawatts, we achieved that by 2050. Now, as an island group, we've kind of committed to doing it a bit earlier than that. So many of you have been through this discussion before, so we're trying to get to 2030. And people are often quite skeptical about that. But again, Neil showed some evidence that in terms of our households, us as citizens, we're making great strides there. Look at the EV uptake that we have here. And the other point is that Orkney doesn't just have an ambition to generate enough energy for itself. What we're looking to do is to be a powerhouse for the rest of the UK. Now, it's still an open question about how much that impinges on our onshore energy system, but at the moment, it doesn't feel that anybody's looking at what that capacity may mean for Orkney. So we need to think about planning for the right plan, not for yesterday's plan. And another part of that is the way in which energy developments will take place. And if you look at any of the government policies at the moment, they describe certain milestones. By 2030, we're going to have done this, 2035, we're going to have done that, 2040, we'll do that. But in none of those plans do they distribute that progress geographically. And the problem is that you don't suddenly just go from 1% to 10% to 30%. You need infrastructure, you need transition planning, you need workforces to make the transition work. You need people in a financial position to be able to make that transition work. And again, nobody's planning for that. And so the progress that we've been able to make in Orkney has almost been despite the system, not because of the system. And it's testimony to the resilience of everybody in here and everybody that isn't here that we've still been able to make some progress. So our not just proposition, but it's an obvious reality is that development is going to take place on a cluster by cluster basis. We have to transition areas for transitioning to 100% on a basis so everybody can get electric vehicles, you can upgrade the houses, etc. on that basis. So the question then is where first? And I think that Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles have all put their hands up very strongly and said in different ways, we want to be early in this energy transition. Now, part of it is because we pay so much for our current energy and it's come at us in a totally inappropriate way. But it's also because we want to be at the forefront of the opportunities that come in the future. And just like Shetland and Orkney were able to embrace the oil sector, we want to embrace renewables in the same way and be at the front end of it and not at the back end of it. And so we need to look at a solution which helps support the edges progressing first and then moving to the center, rather than the center finding a solution and then trying to apply it to the outside. And the context there is really important with the changing government at Westminster, because there's an opportunity for the first time in 14 years to perhaps do something different. Now, that doesn't mean we haven't tried to influence the old government. We have on many, many occasions, and there have been some successes there, but the pace of change and the scale of need is so much greater now. And Orkney has a number of facets which align really strongly with the manifesto commitments and objectives that Labour have set out. So now we need to make sure that we deliver on those. And as well as having that capacity, we need to be able to demonstrate that. And this is one of the tools that maybe we need to use, which is a today and tomorrow tool rather than a yesterday tool, is to build a digital twin, not just of our energy system, but of our, if you like, our existence, our environment. What is it that we live in that we can test different scenarios? The scenarios that Neil showed us, they happen as a graph, but they also happen across our landscapes, across our seascapes. And we have the capacity, even within Orkney, to do that. And so unleashing that potential is one of the opportunities, but also the challenges that we have to have, because we need the mandate from the decision makers for our models to be used in predicting the future, rather than those other models that I showed you, which are perhaps not so appropriate for the reality that we live in. So I'm going to hand back to Neil to look at some of the other R&D opportunities that we have facing us.
Thanks, Gareth. Because as explained, we really have been making quite a lot of waves, pun intended, about in terms of bringing different renewable systems to the grid, and that's been pretty successful overall. The thing that's been doing the heavy lifting in terms of our renewable generation has been onshore wind. And that's been very, very important. And it goes back to the 1950s with the erection of the Costa Head wind turbine through Burger Hill, and then subsequently to a load of different developments. But some of those developments have been small-scale, incremental, personal commitment investments. So the wind turbines on the left-hand side are generally domestic wind turbines, of which there are 736 on the feed-in tariff scheme. So that's been a big commitment. In other words, 1/9, 736 turbines is 1/9 of all of the domestic wind turbines of the UK are in this county. We are a place that has adopted that technology, and you talk to anybody who's got one, or pretty much everybody's got one, they're happy with it. But the other piece that's also coming along will be the developments underpinned by the council for the 3 wind farms that have been proposed and have got permission. And the big question is, how are they going to get delivered? Because the advantage of these systems is that A, they work, but B, because will be owned by the council, the benefits from them get socialised. Personally, I think that's a really good way of doing it. I really support the work that the council is trying to do there. And it has also allowed the triggering of the grid reinforcement that's due to happen. So I just hope the council follows through with these. From a more personal level, what's going on is what's happening with marine energy. And these 4 photographs, all taken in Orkney waters. And the top left-hand corner is the orbital tidal turbine, which is in the water at the Fall of Warness. Top right, Magellanes, their machine, I think is still in Scapa Flow. They've taken it there. They'll be doing some work away from here on it shortly. And then the wave machines at the bottom are both scale machines that were funded by Wave Energy Scotland, both of which have been doing a lot of work. And the point is that we just keep plugging away at it, and the marine industry is expanding. But it's expanding faster in the tidal area than it is in the wave area. And so we have got some significant plans for trying to take the next developmental stages for tidal energy, because we have got more turbines coming at us than we can fit onto the limited grid that is available to us. Now, we've got to do a lot of work on that, but frankly, I regret to say we're always going to be at the back of the queue for getting access to the grid. And that's because we are an R&D activity trying to fight our way into a commercial space. And that's always going to be hard. And that's why government support is needed to keep pushing us into that fray to make sure that we can make the most of it. Because the point is, we are trying to develop a new energy system, but we're hampered by the limits of a 20th century, principally coal-fired grid. That's the change we're trying to make at the same time as making this kit work. So that keeps us busy, to say the least. But one of the ways around the grid that we looked at some years ago, which is really I want to talk to you about now, is the work we do with hydrogen. And we've been using hydrogen as a way to try and evade some of the restrictions there are with the grid. And that's been quite an interesting journey of exploration. because we've done a lot of work in a whole number of different ways, because we've sought to use hydrogen in uh, a number of uh, processes. So we've used it, or tried to use it for vessel fuel, for onshore fuel cells, heating, road vehicles, as a storage medium, and using gas to power electric aircraft. But the point that Eric made earlier, which was the big breakthrough for us, was when Pete came along with his idea for taking hydrogen and combining that with carbon and actually making a synthetic fuel. And this e-fuel process, was a real breakthrough for us. This all happened during COVID, and we did some work with Pete and the team from IGTL. And Pete brought his kit down, which arrived basically in a horse box, giving you an indication of scale, which is brilliant, and did work down at Billy Crew, and the temporary plant was installed at the site. He did all the hard work. We just provide the site. All the hydrogen, and brought some carbon dioxide in, and as Eric explained, that was used by the RAF in their first ever fully synthetically fueled flight. And frankly, this absolutely opened our eyes to the opportunities that this presents, because all of a sudden, if you can do this with carbon captured from the atmosphere and hydrogen made from water, both of which powered by renewables, you end up with a synthetic fuel that frankly has no additional burden on the atmosphere, and is pretty much is carbon neutral, and it's pretty much climate neutral depending where you fly. All right, it's a bit about if you're flying high, there are still some challenges, but really this leads us to a different place. So very quickly, this is important as a chemistry lesson, science festival, pin back your ears, because the important thing to recognize is what we do at the moment. So we basically, our flying is principally powered by diesel. So kerosene, aviation fuel, whatever you like, it's basically diesel. And if you compare all other fuels with diesel, you end up with an interesting position, which is what I'm going to take you through now, which principally is that if you plot diesel on the map by on that graph by density and by volume, you end up with things that are lighter over to the right-hand side, things that are heavier to the left-hand side, things that require more space down the bottom, things that require less space at the top. And if you plot all the other fuels in the form of liquids, hydrogen, and the rest of it, you end up with a scatter graph like this. But the most important thing is all the gases, you have to hold them in something. They have to be contained. And so by the time you wrap the containment on them as well, the dots move to the ends of the arrows. Okay? Now, all the hydrogen stuff is over in the bottom right-hand corner because it's very, very light and very, very energetic, but you can't store much of it as it is. And if you then wrap on the storage and all this lot, you end up with an interesting position. And the bottom line from that is, if you look at all the fuels, there is nothing up and to the right of diesel. In other words, there's nothing that's better than diesel. And similarly, there's almost nothing, by the time you put the storage on, that's even half as good as diesel. Now, I'm not suggesting we just give up on decarbonisation and go and give renewables a rest. This is all powered by renewables. The manufacture of this fuel is difficult and is expensive and costly, and it needs energy. But if we're going to continue to fly, you're going to need to use diesel, in my opinion. So that was the big breakthrough moment for us, because basically what it comes down to is we looked at all the different types of fuels that are around, and we looked at the uses of those fuels, and we did a quick evaluation of what is available in this non-fossil world. And we did a bit of work on a graph that I'm going to show you in a second. Basically, there's three colours. Green, feasible or already doing it. Red is impractical, impossible, or play bonkers. And then amber is possible, but we're not quite sure where that's going. And so the caveat on this is the view as of 2024. Technology changes, the world may change, but this is the view now. So if you look at the different types of transport fuels and you look at all the different types of transport we engage in, and across the top you then look at all the different types of fuels, you can categorize all those in one form or another. I don't expect you to absorb all this in a oneer, but basically what it comes down to is left-hand side, a lot of electrification going on. The middle bit, a lot of question marks that we're not quite sure about. Some bits we're absolutely sure about. So, for example, overhead electric is the first column, and there's not really much overhead electric spacecraft. I think we'd be pretty clear about that. Or bicycle, or sort of motorcycles. But there are trains, so that's why there's a green in that one. And if you go into the middle bit, you end up with a bunch of questions. Some of them are practical, some of them are impractical. and some of them are just going to get fought out by the engine manufacturers. But the big piece that was really important to us was that the ones on the right-hand side basically all contain hydrogen. And if you look down the bottom right-hand corner, there's a couple of green Ys down there, which are short-haul and long-haul flight using e-kerosene, i.e. diesel, are actually feasible. And there is no real green alternative to that. So that was our moment of breakthrough, because it basically said, if you electrify what you can, use other fuels for where, if you can't electrify it, there is some uncertainty in the middle of that graph, which is understood, but we are going to need to use direct air capture to get the carbon in some way to combine with the hydrogen. And the point is, does that give us another way to export the energy that surrounds us, all these gigawatts that Gareth was talking about? Is this going to be the way in which we export energy from the islands? We strongly suspect it is going to be. And the point is, we do have an opportunity on our doorstep, which is Flotter. Now, at the moment, it's being talked about as a hydrogen hub, but frankly, we expect it could actually become an e-fuels hub. So this is a means by which we're getting energy off the islands in that form. So that's one piece about the hydrogen side of things. The other thing I also want to touch on very, very quickly on one slide is about efficiency. Making this fuel is going to be harder than it is at the moment. At the moment, drilling a hole in the sea, which actually is quite hard, is quite easy compared with some of the stuff we're about to do. But we've got to make sure we use our fuel as efficiently as possible. And the particular one that is bugging me at the moment is our ferries, because we know what our ferries do at the moment. And we have an obligation, the International Maritime Organization has an obligation to be halfway to net zero by 2050. And the year before last, they changed that to net zero by 2050. So given the age of our ferries, the replacement ferries that we're going to have are going to need to be net zero by the end of their life. So we have a choice about that, because if we keep using ferries as we are, we use about 3 million litres of diesel a year. That's about 8,000 tonnes of CO2 just from our ferries alone. And if we go like for like, we'll end up with similar emissions. So if we go for more efficient hull shapes, like the Pennsylvania or the Alfred, we will end up with fuel efficiency savings there, and therefore part decarbonisation. But we can also go for the radically different ones, and we're hearing the hydrofoil bottom left-hand corner is turning up next month. So the trial of these is really helpful, because that one is actually fully electric. And so, in my opinion, there are a couple of likely solutions. We'll end up with a mix of some hydrofoils and some catamarans for efficiency purposes, and we will end up with hybrid vessels largely, which will have diesel engines running on green diesel and principally electric. But there's other ways of doing this, and other people have got experience in electric vessels.
Yes, so one of the things that Orkney is very good at is having a worldly perspective. If you look back at history, Orcadians have always gone all over the world, and it's certainly within Aquatera something that we've tried to do. And we've been really lucky to get a great team established in the Philippines, and they've been doing some work there on electric vessels. And last year, we designed and built and sailed an electric outrigger, which is on the top right photo there. And it was designed to take divers out to dive sites from a dive resort. And there's a larger model, which is the kind of left-hand photo, which is a 20-seater boat. And there's very well-established tourist resorts in the Philippines that are really looking to adopt this technology and allow them to decarbonize the way they're taking people around. And on the back of that success, we've now had interest from the United Nations, and they have a tender out at the moment for the island of Samoa in the Pacific, where they're looking for 6 ferries to serve a number of their inner islands. And we were delighted that we got recognized as the best technical option. And we're just going through another administrative process to see if the commercial side can stand up. But it's absolutely great that Orcadian input and innovation combined with that from the Philippines is being able to deliver a decarbonized boat solution in somewhere as exotic as Samoa and the Philippines. And that innovation, when we talk about innovation in our community, if you're lucky enough to go around all the people and the institutions that are involved in it, there's a tremendous wealth of activity going on. And we've kind of thought that it might be good to think about offshore wind. Obviously, we've talked about the importance that might have, and think about what is the infrastructure and what are the questions that we should be asking ourselves as a community. In previous presentations, we've maybe talked about some of the solutions. But I think where we're at the moment is that we've got lots of ideas in our community about how we can make things better, but we haven't necessarily got the mandate to deliver them. So we thought it might be useful to just pose some questions instead. And so if you look down the left-hand side, it looks at different topics. So systematically thinking about the leasing processes um, and thinking about how Orkney relates to those leasing processes. Now, sometimes we're in charge of that. Sometimes we're having to react to what the Crown Estate Scotland do. But we've got an opportunity now, having seen what happened with ScotWind 1, to think about what do we do for ScotWind 2 or 3 or 4, because they will be coming. Have we got lessons that we should already be learning from that? In terms of the planning processes that come with that, are the solutions that we're finding for delivering the energy from wind and the places where the wind farms are being put, are they in the right places? Is the technology right for the environmental and social and economic issues around them? In terms of experimentation, are we coming through with the right solutions to solve the problems with moorings, with construction of turbines that are 300 meters high, floating them out to sea cost effectively, and dealing with the energy that's generated by them? And in terms of the supply chain, it was really interesting. One of Tim Noble's, he showed us this morning that one of the cornerstones of the Zetland and Orkney County Councils Act is it was called the orderly introduction of services from outside the islands into the islands. The orderly introduction. I thought that was a great phrase. Basically, that's in modern parlance, I think that's called supply chain management. So I'll pose the question, are we managing the supply chain in the right way? Are we putting the right strictures on people coming to the islands to deliver services? Are we developing the right capacity within our islands? When Flotta started, there was nobody on the islands that had ever probably seen an oil terminal, let alone develop one. And now 99% of the people that run Flotta are from Orkney. So how do we make the most of that? And then finally, in terms of the port infrastructure, we've got a number of ideas about how we can use Scapa Flow. Scapa Flow, as we always say, is unique in the world. It's the largest natural harbour in the Northern Hemisphere. It will have a role in the delivery of offshore wind in Scotland. That's not up for debate. The only debate is whether Orkney is going to have a role in that delivery or whether other people are going to come and use Scapa Flow on our behalf, as it were. And then in terms of the energy use and conversion, Neil touched on the future of Flotta, and are we thinking enough about that transition of Flotta? It's, as we've seen in the press, it's under new commercial pressures at the moment. Are we having the right conversations about how it could become an e-fuels hub in the future? We've got the Cromarty Firth again. We've seen in the papers how they've become a green free port under the last government. Are we interacting with them in the right way? Can we get more out of that relationship? And in terms of the vessels that are going to service this, it's not only the fuels, but it's also about who owns them. The Maersks, the Blue, the Normand group in Norway, all of these shipping companies have emerged in the last 50 years from nothing. There's no reason why the ships that come and serve the offshore wind industry couldn't be an Orkney fleet, a Shetland fleet, a Western Isles fleet. We just need to get on with it. And finally, then that's linked to the investment process. So are we thinking in the right way about investing in that future? Are we mobilizing the funds that we have in the right way for that? So pass back to Neil.
So one of the ways in which we can try and make offshore wind, and particularly floating offshore wind, a success is use the experience that we've already got. And we're offering the experience that we've had at EMEC of helping people to get unknown machines, wave and tidal engine machines, into the environment and recycling that knowledge and that support to do the same thing for floating offshore wind. So as Gareth said, these are going to be big structures put in a place that we don't really know how to make work. So we're proposing the idea of a national floating wind test centre and hosting that out west of Orkney. Now, to give you some indication of scale, where did you find the laser? Is
that is right in the middle one.
Oh, there you go.
The big one.
The big one marked laser. That'll be the one. Yeah, okay. Thought else fails, read the instructions. Good tip there. And then next stage is follow the instructions. But this is where we are at Billy, and that little bit there, you may be able to see at the back, is our wave energy test site at the moment. And so we're looking to do something that is 20 or so kilometres out to sea. Give you an indication, these machines could be 300 metres high, but if you stood on the beach at Billy Crew and put your hand out, they would actually be half the height of your little fingernail at that distance. So right on the horizon, and painted a colour you barely see, but a long way out. But we think there's a big opportunity for testing the floating aspect to these machines. And so we've looked at different test centres that exist around Europe. And you can see here from Spain, Norway, France, and all of these sites, if you plot them against the wave power, i.e. the power the machine's going to have to endure, and against the wind speed, which is again, or the wind power, the energy that they're going to be trying to harvest, you end up locating these spots. And the bottom line is Orkney's out there. And the thing is, that's the North Atlantic. This is where this stuff's going to go. And we keep making the same point that there is an advantage in testing machines in their ultimate state, because if they can go here, they can go to California or Chile or wherever. So it helps build an international testing standard that would actually be of value. So this is something we're promoting at the moment to government, and we'll see how we get on. Once again, the challenge is, however, we're once again held back by a 20th century grid, but we're trying to find a way around that one as well. So I'm going to hand back to Gareth, because there's a whole load of other things that have been going on, not just in those plans, but some actual physical stuff that's going on right at the moment.
Yeah. So what we want to do is beginning to wind up now. So we've kind of gone for the wide energy system stuff, that maybe gigawatts of power that might be generated around us. But let's come back to what we're doing ourselves day by day in terms of the transition. And we've made great progress, but we've still got a long way to go. And one of the ways that many of us in Orkney have embraced that was through the Reflex initiative. And that was kicked off before COVID. It took us through COVID, and we had 1,000 people in Orkney who engaged with that process as members. And we had really, really high hopes that that was going to be a springboard for like rapid transition. And COVID and regulation kind of got in the way from that. And what we found is that there's a lot of what are euphemistically called non-technical difficulties around that, which we had to solve. And we're still in that mode of solving them, to the extent that some of the politicians and Ofgem and other people that come up are really intrigued and interested in the pain that we've collectively endured over the last 20 years. But it's just to let you know that Reflex is alive and kicking, and it's still delivering where it can on the EV side. And there's some really great work going on with the team to look at some new heating solutions. Some of you may have seen this at the county show. And we're hoping that over the next weeks and months that can be reinvigorated again. And the importance of Reflex was that it invoked that sense of collective movement. It invited people to become members of Reflex, and you could go on there, and you still can go onto the website and look at your carbon footprint in your own life. And one of the developments we're trying to make now is that you almost can then begin to track it and see how that develops over time. So Reflex is still alive and kicking. And one of the things that we learned from Reflex is, and this is a very non-technical solution, if you like, is that it's about finance of energy. And at the moment, our whole system is predicated on the top of this graphic, which basically shows that we have a relatively low capital investment, but we get strung along for the operational costs, basically to have to buy the fuel and the electricity. And we've all seen our electricity prices double through the price crisis. And the irony of that, in that it was fixed to gas, and obviously we don't have any gas in Orkney, and none of our electricity really used gas. So it was really rich for us to be able to, or have to pay that dividend. But what Reflex showed us is that if we invest in renewables, we can get into a different trajectory. But what we need is help to invest in the capital. And so I think you probably heard me speak last year, those of you that hear, about the importance of an energy transition bank. And Howie Firth, I think, was the first person I ever heard in Orkney speak about local banks. And I think as we've lived through the last years, it's become even more important that we get that. And hopefully that's something that GB Energy could maybe move towards. So we need to canvass for that with the new government. The other thing that we've often posed a question about, and we had a chance of answering this year, was what does net zero mean? It was this coin that was invented perhaps to allow the countries that had very high forests, places like Brazil, to use the fact that they could be sequestrating carbon out of the rainforests as a benefit in their carbon equations. But at a local level, it should mean something as well. So if we have a means of sequestering carbon out of the system, then we should get credit for it. Now, the unfortunate news is that in Orkney, given the landscape and the seascapes that we have, although there are things that do take carbon out of the atmosphere, they're not nearly enough to make us carbon positive, if you like, as an absorber of carbon. And so in Orkney's equation, if you like, net zero actually means zero emissions. We're not going to get any credit from the nature helping us. So that's something that we kind of came to a conclusion about this year, and it's good to be able to share, although it just shows the scale of the challenge a little bit more. And very often I get commented on by my team about don't forget the environment. We talk a lot about the social side, the economic side, the technology side, but there is obviously a very rich and dynamic ecosystem that we all live in, and that these energy solutions are going to be put into. And we're already starting to see that system change because of the changing temperature and changing climate. I was just speaking to a visiting marine biologist who was saying that the average water temperature around the UK this year has gone up by 4 degrees through this summer. And some of you may have seen on the BBC the graph of the ocean temperature, and it bobbles along, and then suddenly this year and last year it's much, much higher. So it's likely that that is a foretell of some very dramatic changes that are likely to happen in species going forward. And again, that mantra of don't plan for what it was, think about what it might be in the future. It means that whatever we do with the technology, we're going to have to deal with species and habitat change anyhow. So to kind of wind up then, what about our community? Are we ready for all of this stuff that we've talked about? And what is it that we should be doing to make ourselves as ready as possible?
Click on the end.
So one of them is around the fact that we need to recognize what we're doing. So often it's easy to think about what we're not doing, but we actually need to recognize the progress that we're all making as individuals, as organizations, and as groups. But I think where there is a question mark is that perhaps in part because of COVID and some of the other pressures that we've seen, I think it's in the discussions I've had, there's a feeling that we've become more siloed in our activities over the last 5 years. So these activities aren't as collective and collaborative as they could be. So maybe that's something for us to think about. The other thing is that we've shown our capacity to be transition agents. There was a very amusing select committee who came up from Westminster one time, and they said, "Oh, we've been told that the problem is the public aren't ready for change." And we said, "Actually, that's absolutely wrong. The public have been ready for change for a long time. The problem is the regulators and the administrators and the advisors." And so, we need to make that clear. We need to make clear that we're ready for positive change. And we need those organizations and businesses that are coming to Orkney to follow that lead. There's an element of possible colonialism, recolonialism with what's happening at the moment. As a society, we've lived with oil. We've learned a lot from oil. We've got a lot of ideas about how to manage our community through industrial development. We've got to make sure that that voice is heard. And so, as a community, it feels to me we need to urgently get a much broader based conversation going about what we're doing, how we're going to do it, and importantly, what are we doing in the future? And I think the Science Festival, as ever, is a great stimulus for that. Some of the talks are absolutely inspiring in terms of the opportunities that are there and the way we can make that work. And if we do that in the right way, then we can secure the best outcomes that are possible for Orkney. And one of the things that I've said in a number of talks recently is that personally, I've never been more optimistic about the opportunities that could be out there for us as a community. But I also have never seen the levels of jeopardy that I see if we don't make the right decisions and we don't go down the right pathway. And it's that conundrum of being at a stage of major change? Do we make the right path? Do we go down the wrong path? And those options are quite different. So that's all about conversations. Every challenge, every problem in the world is always solved by communication and conversations. This is a great conversation, and it's brilliant to have the opportunity to share that with you. And I'll just pass over to Neil for the final word.
Yeah. Just finally to say that the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum is a great opportunity to come and hear about ideas and discuss ideas. We meet monthly, so please, if you're interested in participating, do come and join in. Because it's only by those conversations that different things can happen. And this one in particular happened because Pete was a strong member of OREF, and conversations happened that then led to him being able to fulfil his dream. And I think that is showing us the way to the new future. So with that, we'll say thank you very much indeed, and we'll take it. Well, Gareth will take questions. I've got to go for a doctor's appointment at 3:30 in Stromness, so I'm going to run away from all the questions. So there you go. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, as we heard, Neil has to go, but Gareth has kindly agreed to stay behind and take your questions. Now, I'm going to run this until about 3:05 or so, but what we're also going to do is we're going to open up the Grenier room up the top right as you are sitting. So after I close this up, people who want to talk, discuss with Gareth, we can go up into the Grenier room. There's a pop-up cafe with an honesty box, and you can talk at your leisure. That allows the tech people to change over for the next event. So, Neil mentioned read the instructions and then follow them. I should have listened to my instructions and taken my iPad for the Slido. But if anyone's got a question before I open this up, could you put your hand up and someone will take the mic to you? Got a question here, Louisa, down the bottom. I told you I'd make you run up and down these stairs.
Thank you. Sorry, can I ask what might sound like an innocent question? And bearing in mind, I'm a visitor to Orkney rather than an Orcadian. But how much of this revolution requires overhead pylons around the landscape?
Very good question. It depends how you then frame that question. Is it technically possible to deliver electricity over the country without overhead pylons? Yes. There are subsea solutions, there are buried cable solutions. The question then comes down to cost and some sensitivities in some areas. So there are some types of land and some types of feature where it's possibly better to have an overhead line than a undergrounded cable. But I think on balance, it's probably a question of cost. And so, yeah, it's how we invest in our energy system. And one of the observations, and it might be the kind of the off-ramp of the conundrum, is that our existing pylons were built to distribute very centralized energy all over the country over very long distances. Before Orkney became 100% reliant on our own energy, we were pulling energy from Peterhead. So if you like, we had a responsibility as far as Peterhead for some of the overhead lines. I think in the world that we're thinking about tomorrow, I would postulate that we actually don't need as much of that high-level, high-powered distribution grid if we manage the location of energy generation and think about that in the context of use. So, yeah. Come back.
Sorry. Yeah, just a quick remark then on that. I mean, my perception is that if Orkney gets overhead power lines within Orkney landscapes, it's going to be a disaster. I'm not a landscape specialist. I'm just making a general comment. And your last slide was talking about the conversations that need to happen. I would hope, for instance, that Orkney's MP and MSPs are fully abreast of what the scenarios are and what the problems would be and what the dangers would be for Orkney's landscapes. And they are therefore advocating into the system in Edinburgh, maybe more widely, for Orkney really to have control over what decisions are made about its power interconnector infrastructure.
So, so the good news is that the first transmission level connection that's come onto Orkney is going to be coming by subsea cable, and then it's going to be through a buried cable. And there has been, at least for the last decade, an expectation that there wouldn't be pylons across Orkney, and the level of infrastructure that's been talked about is what are called trident poles, which are 2 wooden poles with 3 isolators on the top, which are much bigger or considerably bigger than the existing system, but they're not the same as pylons. So you're discussing or describing a debate that needs to happen. I think on the communication side, the challenge is that a lot of the electrical systems, there's deemed consent for them. And so the planning process is not necessarily as open to scrutiny as for some other types of development. And that's where having a collective wisdom, if you like, about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable is very worthwhile. And I don't think it's just for Alistair and Liam at the moment. That needs to be a wider discussion as well. But thank you.
Great, we've got one just behind you, Louisa.
Hi, it's more just a comment, which is my idea of a disaster for Orkney is actually climate change and rising sea levels. It's going to be 10 times the disaster of having some pylons across our landscape. I'm sorry, I think sometimes we have to be realistic about what is a disaster. And I think we are so low-lying, and that's the bigger problem than having some pylons.
Oh, thanks, Marion. And I think that just highlights the importance of discussion and debate, because it's only through, we're not going to solve it today in this forum, but one thing to appreciate is that whatever opinion any of us have on something, there's always somebody that might agree with us, but there's also somebody that might have an alternative opinion. And so, I think when Orkney works well, we have a broad enough conversation and we reach consensus. When we don't work so well is when we get little small conversations happening that then have a huge impact on everybody else. So it's just the importance of investing in big conversations that get us to the right solutions.
I'm going to take one more question in the auditorium, Gareth, and then we'll move up to the Grain Air room. That's that fine with you?
Yeah. Hello, Gareth.
Hi, Lindsay.
I think my question is whether Orkney Renewable Energy Forum is in a conversation with people like Repsol and the people who have control of some of the infrastructure for energy change.
I think as an organisation, it would be true to say that ORF isn't in those conversations. I know that, for example, one of the other organisations that ORF has tried to engage with is the DNO and the transmission planners, and that has been very difficult for ORF over probably 20 years. And I think what we do see in ORF is that members of ORF have links and communication with some of these organisations, and that's helped us maintain some level of communication. So I think it could be a lot better than it is at the moment, and in particular, it could be much more substantial. I think there's quite a lot of, not picking on any one of the companies, but I think there's some very fundamental things that are going to happen to each of these sites and each of the opportunities and each of the projects that are happening. And there's substantive issues that need to be addressed that I think, as far as we're aware at the moment, are still not resolved in an optimal way. So there's an opportunity there to perhaps do that if we get the right conversation happening.
Okay.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Right, thank you. Right, so I'm just going to wind up there. Gareth, thank you very much. Neil, in his absence, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to do the tribute to Pete. That was great. And can I just thank you, the audience, and thank our guest speakers in the usual way. Thank you.